There was a time when all the world agreed the ancient triangle to be the great symbol of truth and God. Although it was just an ancient relic, mankind thought it contained the complete expression of truth. Men studied the relic. The most devout men and women made pilgrimages to see it. Sketches were made and sermons preached about the great truths contained in a mere copy of the symbol. Men went to college to study the deep truths of the triangle as a symbol. It is a depiction of God himself, they claimed, equilateral, having 3 sides, each in perfect harmony, 3 yet one, triune and single, depicting the same substance, no part of which is created inferior to the other. Although God may be unknowable, this symbol teaches truths about him. Many doctoral dissertations were written on the great truths of the triangle. The brightest minds for generations went to study the triangle and returned to give their messages praising Triangularity. Look at how it points upward. It shows how man was meant to reach up and to seek after the approval from God, said one of the great triangular theologians. Sciences were advanced from the benefits of studying the triangle. Over time, whole libraries were written on the subject of the triangle. Society itself advanced, and it was the universal proclamation of a united mankind that God's greatest gift was the triangle. As in all matters in which there is uniformity of opinion, however, men began to question whether others held sufficiently orthodox views of the great Triangularity. Creeds were adopted and then enforced to ensure there was no mistake in dogma about the triangle. Those suspected of disbelief in the creeds over the generations were first shunned, then abused, then killed to ensure orthodoxy was universal. It is blasphemy to abuse God, they proclaimed, and the triangle is his great symbol. Whoso offends against the triangle offends God. Men stopped searching for additional insights from the triangle, for fear any new insight might be viewed as heterodox. Their understanding became stilted, and light was lost. At length, a great darkness settled over the minds of mankind, as less and less of their former understanding was preserved, and creeds were imposed through the threat and use of violence. The creeds became the new focus, and pilgrimages to the ancient triangle stopped. Its surroundings were neglected, and weeds overgrew it. An Orthodox young man who believed earnestly in God could not help but notice the cruelty of his own orthodoxy. He despaired. His despair turned to anger. He grew in anger until he could no longer remain at peace. He went on a pilgrimage to the ancient triangle relic, and in his anger kicked at it again and again, though he thought it was blasphemy to do so. As he vented his rage by striking at it, he was surprised when it moved under his blows. No one had ever thought to disturb the ancient symbol before. In an age of orthodoxy, it would be heretical to even think to do so. Yet here, at the ancient shrine, the angry young man saw for the first time in many generations there was more to the symbol than any other living man had seen. He realized it was not blasphemy, but pure desire which motivated his acts. After making his first discovery, he dug about the triangle and found, when another side was exposed, it was not just a triangle, but it was also a square. There were 2 symbols here. He reflected long and deeply upon his discovery. As his meditations grew into conclusions, he began to speak openly of his discovery. He proclaimed, "The great triangle alone cannot stand for God. There is more to him and his grace than just one symbol. There is a square which symbolizes him as well. The symbol of the square shows us how God's presence is meant for the 4 corners of the world and cannot be confined only to those who confess the creeds of Triangularity. God is equal in his love of all mankind, and the square symbolizes his equality of treatment of all mankind scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. After all, he makes his rain to fall on both the just and the unjust." This new idea caught hold among many who were tired of the abuses of creedal orthodox thought. A great schism developed in the minds and hearts of mankind between the new believers and the old beliefs. Those who accepted God's grace as symbolized in the square did not reject the triangle, but did not limit their views to the triangle either. Others rejected any idea of grace, claiming it was the creeds and traditions which guaranteed harmony with God and peace among mankind. This idea of grace symbolized by the square is dangerous, threatening safety and harmony, they claimed. Wars were fought to protect the peace, as the followers of these two different views collided. Libraries were neglected, then burned in the violence of war. Intelligence was lost. Wars brought hunger as men neglected the normal responsibilities of the farm. Hunger brought more violence as men robbed rather than starve. Disease followed as hungry men lived among both the unburied dead and the injured violent. At length, men lost the virility to fight, and they decided it was God's will to punish them for their intolerance. During this peace born from exhaustion, men began to discuss the interplay between the triangle and the square with an openness not possible before. Great discussions followed about how these two symbols taught men about God. New libraries were written. Accommodations were reached between the creedal loyalists and the new tradition. Tolerance spread. Though there were two sides, and though they opposed each other, they agreed to live in harmony. From time to time, men and women were converted and changed sides. One day, there was another young man who searched into the competing views of the Triangularists and the Reformers who proclaimed God's grace in the square as well. He could not decide which was right. On a beautiful spring morning, he caught a glimpse of light which clarified his thinking. Without the benefit of having read any of the libraries about the triangle or the square, the young man said he recognized in these symbols another, higher principle. He claimed to see in them the pyramid. He began to teach a pyramid is both a triangle and a square. It is the only square with a center point fixed by the triangles of its sides. The center point, aimed upwards, was the great symbol of God's house. When, in times past, God met with men, he did so on the mountains. All truths can be encompassed within the shape of the pyramid. Some few recognized in the words of the young man a harmony of the symbols which was lacking in the traditions of the creedal triangulists or those proclaiming God's grace in the square. Most, however, from both sides of the historic schools were opposed to the young man and his new additions to tradition. He is a heretic, they proclaimed. He aims at another schism, they shouted. This is dangerous and will lead to destruction. The young man and his followers built a pyramid of their own as a new symbol of God. As they did so, the young man claimed to see yet more light and said, I see now the great symbol is not only a triangle and a square and a pyramid, but it is also a prism. It was meant to refract light. It was meant to be a tool. It can magnify our sight. It can concentrate the heat of the sun. It can improve our lives. It is the great symbol of a living God. Increasing crowds believed that the young man and his followers were going too far. His teachings were threatening to repeat the great schism of the past, in which violence, war, starvation, and disease were inflicted upon mankind. He must die, they concluded. As the gathering storm clouds settled about the young man, he knew he had only a little time. He preached his last sermon as a mob approached. I have learned, he began, that the symbol God has given us was always intended to show us more. It is a prism, but not one intended to be used for viewing merely earthly things. It was always intended to be directed upward toward heaven, from where all light and perfection comes. The symbol we have been given has always been the great symbol of God's communication with us. We are meant to talk with God Himself. Each one of us must have and use the prism, the light, the perfection, which alone comes from God. He was killed by the mob shortly after his sermon ended. His small group of followers were driven into the wilderness. A new tradition began in the wilderness. As often happens when mankind settles a wilderness, the fight for survival takes such energy and expense that time for study and reflection is limited. When, at last, the time of survival passed and a time of plenty came, the young man's followers had of necessity neglected some of the things he had taught. It was necessary to go back to relearn lost truths in order to go forward. He spoke of a prism to be pointed at heaven, said some. This was meant to apply to us all. Each of us must do this, and each must speak with God. No, said others, this was meant to apply to us collectively. We all speak with God when our leaders speak with Him. It is wrong, even presumptuous, for the common man to think he may speak with God. It did not matter if the leaders themselves proclaimed, all must speak with God, all must learn from Him directly. There remained those who thought it wrong, even heretical, for a common man to speak with God. An uneasy peace settled upon the young man's followers. At length, however, they too concluded it advisable to have their own orthodox thought. It is important to have uniformity in beliefs, some proclaimed. To avoid offending God, God expects us to be one and therefore must be displeased when we lack uniformity. But, said others, without the freedom to find God in our own lives, we are no different than the traditionalists. Surely our new faith stands for modern communication with God, or it stands for nothing. The growing controversy within the new tradition in the wilderness was in danger of following the same dangerous path as the early Triangularists. Men are alike, even if they follow beliefs which are unalike.